Aisha's hand trembles as she flashes the signal one more time, praying someone, anyone, will see it. The man gripping her shoulder thinks she's just fidgeting. He has no idea she's screaming for help without making a sound. Then she sees him, a massive biker covered in tattoos, standing by the cereal aisle. Their eyes lock. Victor's jaw clenches. He's seen that signal before. And now, with security cameras watching and dozens of witnesses nearby, he faces an impossible choice. Walk away like everyone else, or risk everything for a child he's never met. Before we dive into this incredible story, I need to know where you're watching from. Drop your city and state in the comments right now, because what you're about to hear didn't happen in some distant place to people you'll never know. This happened to a mother working double shifts, to a little black girl who trusted the wrong person, to a biker who refused to look away. And the truth is, this could happen anywhere. Your town, your supermarket, your child. So, tell me where you're watching from, because by the end of this story, you're going to want to share it with every parent, every teacher, every person in your community who needs to hear it. Now let me take you back to where this all began. To a quiet town where nothing bad was supposed to happen. To a little black girl named Aisha, who had no idea that a boring school assembly 3 weeks earlier would become the difference between life and death. Some towns exist in the kind of quiet that city people dream about, nestled in the rolling hills of Virginia, where the streets are lined with oak trees and neighbors still wave from their porches. There's a place where nothing bad is supposed to happen. This is where 8-year-old Aisha grew up. In a small blue house with peeling paint and a garden that bloomed wild with marigolds every summer, Aisha was the kind of child who noticed things most people missed. The way afternoon light danced through leaves, how raindrops raced down window panes. She'd spend hours at the kitchen table with her colored pencils, drawing elaborate worlds filled with castles and dragons and families holding hands. Her mother, Rachel, would sometimes find these drawings tucked under her pillow, little gifts left without explanation, each one signed with a crooked heart. Rachel worked as a nurse at the county hospital, pulling double shifts that stretched her thin but never broke her. She'd come home exhausted, smelling of antiseptic and coffee, her scrubs wrinkled from 12-hour days. But she never missed bedtime stories. Never. It was their ritual, their sacred time. Aisha would curl against her mother's side, and Rachel would read until her daughter's breathing slowed and steadied, even when her own eyes burned with fatigue. Their life had a rhythm to it. School in the morning, where Aisha sat in the back row of Mrs. Patterson's third-grade class, quietly observant. Art class on Tuesday afternoons, which she loved more than anything. Evenings in the garden when weather permitted, where Aisha would help her mother pull weeds and water tomatoes, dirt collecting under their fingernails. Weekends at the library, where Aisha could lose herself in books, while Rachel caught up on sleep in the reading chair nearby. Aisha was shy in the way sensitive children often are. She didn't raise her hand in class unless called upon. She had 2 close friends, but preferred her own company. She trusted easily because she'd never been given reason not to. In her world, adults were safe. Neighbors were kind. Strangers were just friends she hadn't met yet. Rachel tried to teach her otherwise. She'd sit Aisha down periodically, having those uncomfortable conversations that responsible parents force themselves to have. Don't talk to strangers. Don't accept rides. Don't go anywhere with someone unless Mom says it's okay. Aisha would nod solemnly, but behind her eyes, Rachel could see the disconnect. These warnings felt abstract, like fairy tale dangers that existed in other places to other children. Not here. Not in their quiet town where everyone knew everyone and nothing bad ever happened. And for 8 years, Rachel's fears remained hypothetical. Aisha walked to school safely, played in the yard without incident, grew up exactly as a child should, wrapped in the innocent certainty that the world was fundamentally good. But 3 weeks before that day in the supermarket, something happened at Aisha's school that would change everything. A lesson that seemed boring at the time, just another assembly to sit through on a Thursday morning, would become the difference between life and death. If you believe every child deserves to come home safe, hit that subscribe button because what you're about to hear could protect someone you love. It was a Thursday morning when the entire elementary school filed into the gymnasium, 200 children settling cross-legged on the polished floor, with the restless energy of kids who'd rather be anywhere else. Another assembly, another lecture about something adults worried about. The overhead lights buzzed and the air smelled like floor wax, and the peanut butter sandwiches already warming in backpacks for lunch. Officer Patricia Dawson stood at the front, her uniform crisp, her badge catching the fluorescent light. She'd been a police officer for 16 years and had given this presentation at 11 schools across the county. She knew how to read a room, and she could see these children weren't particularly interested. But she also knew that somewhere in this gymnasium there might be a child who would need what she was about to teach them. She began by asking a question. How many of you have ever felt scared but couldn't say anything out loud? Hands rose hesitantly. She nodded, her expression serious but kind. Sometimes we find ourselves in situations where we need help but can't ask for it. Maybe someone's watching. Maybe we're afraid of making things worse. Maybe we can't speak at all. That's why I'm here to teach you something that could save your life. Officer Dawson held up her hand, palm facing outward like she was waving. Now watch carefully, she said. She tucked her thumb into her palm, then folded her 4 fingers down over it, trapping the thumb. This is the signal for help. It was created so that people could ask for assistance without saying a word. If you're on a video call and someone's making you uncomfortable, you can use this. If you're in a car with someone who's scaring you, you can flash this out the window. If you're anywhere and you need help, this signal tells people who understand it that you're in danger. She made them practice. 200 small hands rose in the air, palms out, thumbs tucked, fingers folded down. Some kids giggled nervously. Others took it seriously, their faces scrunched in concentration. Aisha sat in the 3rd row, mimicking the gesture with her classmates, feeling slightly silly. Her best friend Maya sat beside her, and they exchanged glances that said, "This is kind of weird, but okay." Mrs. Patterson, standing along the wall with the other teachers, called out over the murmur of children's voices. "Listen to Officer Dawson? Everyone, this signal could save your life someday." The words hung in the air for a moment, heavy with importance that most of the children couldn't quite grasp. Officer Dawson had them practiced 3 more times. She explained that the signal worked because it was unusual enough to catch attention, but subtle enough not to alert an abuser or captor. She told them that good people, aware people, would recognize it. Police officers knew it. Teachers knew it. More and more adults were learning it every day. Aisha made the signal again, her small fingers folding over her thumb. She thought about how strange it was that a simple hand gesture could mean, "Help me?" She filed it away in her mind alongside other things adults insisted were important, like looking both ways before crossing the street and never touching a hot stove. The assembly ended. The children stood, their knees stiff from sitting, and filed back to their classrooms. Within an hour, most of them had forgotten about it entirely. By the end of the week, it was buried under spelling tests and playground games and whatever show they were watching on television. Aisha would forget about that signal within days. She'd go back to her drawings, her dolls, her normal life. But 17 days later, when a stranger approached her outside the library with a lie that sounded like truth, that forgotten gesture would be her only hope. And that's where Victor's story begins. Victor Castellano didn't look like someone you'd want your children around. At 52 years old, he stood 6'3" and weighed 240 alsarb, most of it muscle that hadn't softened despite the gray threading through his beard. His arms were covered in tattoos that told stories in ink and shadow. Skulls, eagles, names of brothers who'd ridden beside him, and brothers he'd buried. The leather vest he wore, the colors of the Hells Angels, carried patches earned over 28 years of membership. To most people passing him on the street, he looked exactly the kind of man you'd cross the road to avoid. But people who only saw the surface missed everything that mattered. Victor grew up in a working-class family in Northern California, the eldest of 3 children. His father worked construction, his mother cleaned houses, and they raised their kids to understand that respect was earned through actions, not words. When Victor turned 18, he joined the Marines, not because he was running from something, but because he wanted to serve. He believed in protecting people who couldn't protect themselves. He did 2 tours overseas, saw things that changed him in ways he still couldn't fully articulate, and came home with decorations he kept in a drawer and rarely looked at. He was 19 years old, fresh back from his first deployment when his younger sister disappeared. Her name was Sophie. She was 12. She'd been walking home from a friend's house on a Tuesday afternoon, a route she'd taken 100 times before in a neighborhood where everyone knew everyone. She never made it home. Despite searches that went on for months, despite volunteers combing through fields and forests, despite age-progressed photos and desperate pleas on the evening news, Sophie was never found. The grief nearly destroyed their family. His mother stopped sleeping. His father aged a decade in a year. And Victor, who'd survived combat in a foreign country, discovered that the worst kind of helplessness wasn't facing an enemy you could fight. It was losing someone to a monster you couldn't find. That loss carved something permanent into Victor's soul. It made him vigilant in a way most people never understand. He noticed things. The way adults interacted with children in public, body language that didn't match words, fear hiding behind polite smiles. He couldn't save his sister, but he became determined to be the kind of person who might save someone else's. He found brotherhood in the Hells Angels, joining when he was 24. People heard motorcycle club and imagined criminals, but Victor's chapter was different. Yes, they rode hard and looked intimidating, but they also organized charity rides for children's hospitals. They escorted funeral processions for fallen veterans. They showed up when communities needed protection, standing guard at threatened churches and synagogues. The patches on Victor's vest represented loyalty, service, and a code that meant something deeper than most outsiders would ever understand. Victor never married, never had children of his own, but he became a grandfather figure to every kid in his neighborhood. He fixed motorcycles for single mothers who couldn't afford mechanic bills, asking nothing in return. He shoveled snow from elderly neighbors' driveways at 5 in the morning before they woke. He volunteered with a nonprofit that taught self-defense to children, spending his Saturday mornings showing kids how to break grips, yell for help, and trust their instincts when something felt wrong. It was through that volunteer work that Victor first learned about the signal for help. A counselor demonstrated it during a training session, explaining how it had been developed as a silent distress call. Victor watched the simple gesture, thumb tucked into palm, fingers folded over, and something clicked in his chest. This was it. This was something that could make a difference. He memorized it immediately. He practiced it until recognition became instinct. He made it his mission to spread awareness everywhere he went, teaching it to his club brothers, to the kids in his classes, to anyone who would listen. He started seeing the world through the lens of that signal. When he was out in public, his eyes scanned crowds, not looking for trouble but watching for that one small hand making that one specific gesture. He knew the statistics. He knew how many children went missing every year. He knew that most abductions happened in plain sight, in parking lots and stores and public spaces where everyone was too busy or too uncomfortable to intervene. Victor had spent 33 years preparing for a moment he desperately hoped would never come, training himself to notice, to recognize, to act when others might look away. On the morning of June 22nd, Victor had no plans beyond getting groceries and maybe grabbing lunch with his club brothers. The sky was clear, perfect riding weather. He'd thrown on his vest, fired up his Harley, and headed into town, thinking about nothing more serious than whether to get ground beef or chicken for dinner. He had no idea that in 3 hours he'd be standing in a supermarket, watching a little black girl's hand move in a pattern he'd prayed he'd never see in real life. And the man standing next to that little girl, he wasn't a stranger snatching a random child. The truth was so much worse than that. 3 hours before Victor walked into that supermarket, Aisha sat in the children's section of the public library, her legs swinging from a chair that was slightly too tall for her. She had her sketchbook open, colored pencils scattered across the table, working on a drawing of a dragon she'd been perfecting for days. Rachel's shift at the hospital wouldn't end for another hour, and this had become their routine. The library was safe, familiar. Mrs. Chun, the children's librarian, knew Aisha by name. There were always other families around. Nothing bad happened at the library. Aisha was so absorbed in getting the dragon scales just right that she didn't notice the man watching her from behind the biography section. She didn't see how his eyes tracked her every movement, how his hands trembled slightly as he checked his watch for the 3rd time in 10 minutes, how he took a breath like he was steadying himself before making a decision that couldn't be unmade. His name was Craig Hendress, 38 years old, clean-cut in the way that made people trust him instinctively. He wore khaki pants and a button-down shirt, glasses that gave him an accountant's harmless appearance. He looked like someone's helpful co-worker, someone's dependable neighbor. He looked exactly like the kind of person you'd never suspect of anything wrong. But Craig had been watching Aisha for weeks. He knew her routine. He knew what time Rachel dropped her off. He knew she came here every Thursday while her mother worked late. He'd been planning this moment with the obsessive precision of someone who'd thought of nothing else for months. 2 years ago, Craig had dated Rachel for 7 months. In the beginning, he'd seemed perfect, attentive, generous, interested in her life. But slowly, things shifted. He started showing up at the hospital unannounced, calling multiple times a day, needing to know where she was and who she was with, going through her phone when he thought she wasn't looking. When Rachel tried to create boundaries, he'd twist things, making her feel guilty for wanting space. When she mentioned breaking up, he'd become someone she didn't recognize. His voice cold, his eyes flat. The relationship ended when Rachel discovered he'd been following her, not just occasionally, but systematically. He knew her routes, her schedule, details about her life. He couldn't have known unless he'd been watching constantly. She'd been terrified enough to change her locks, to file a report, though she'd never followed through with a restraining order because he'd disappeared from her life completely. Or so she thought. Craig never left. He just got better at hiding. Now he stood in the library, watching the daughter of the woman who'd rejected him. And in his fractured thinking, he'd convinced himself of a simple truth. If he couldn't have Rachel, he'd take what mattered most to her. And maybe if he had Aisha, Rachel would come back. Maybe she'd realize they were supposed to be a family. He checked the library one more time. Mrs. Chun was helping someone at the desk. The other families were absorbed in their own worlds. No one was paying attention. He walked toward Aisha with the practiced calm of someone who'd rehearsed this moment 100 times in his mind. Aisha looked up when his shadow fell across her drawing. She didn't recognize him immediately. It had been 2 years, and she'd only met him a handful of times when she was 6. His voice was urgent but controlled, pitched just loud enough for her to hear. Aisha, Thank God I found you. It's your mom. There's been an accident at the hospital. She sent me to get you. She needs you right away. Aisha's stomach dropped. The pencil fell from her hand. Her mother. An accident. The words hit her like cold water. But something felt wrong. Something in the way he stood too close. The way his smile didn't reach his eyes. The way his hand moved toward her arm before she'd even responded. Every warning her mother had ever given her screamed in the back of her mind. Don't go with strangers. But Craig wasn't a stranger. Not completely. And he knew things. He knew her mother worked at the hospital. He knew her name. He was describing Rachel's car, the color of her scrubs, the fact that she'd been working a double shift. Details that made his story feel true. Even as every instinct Aisha had told her to run, she hesitated, her eyes darting toward Mrs. Chun at the desk. Craig saw the hesitation and leaned in closer, his voice dropping. She's asking for you, Aisha. She's scared. We need to go now. Please. The plea sounded desperate, and Aisha, who'd been raised to be kind, who trusted too easily, felt the weight of his urgency override her fear. Aisha made a choice that thousands of children are taught to avoid. She went with him, but as Craig led her toward the exit, his hand firm on her shoulder, Aisha's hand slipped into her pocket, clutching her phone, and she did something that would buy her precious minutes. Her fingers moved quickly, muscle memory from texting her mother after school. She couldn't look at the screen without Craig noticing, so she typed blind, praying the words were close enough. She hit send just as they pushed through the library doors into the parking lot. The message that appeared on Rachel's phone 30 seconds later was barely coherent. Just 2 words and a jumble of letters. Help lib. Rachel's phone buzzed during a lull between patients. She almost didn't check it, her hands still gloved. Her mind focused on the young man in bed 3 who needed stitches. But something made her glance at the screen. 2 words glowed back at her. Help lib. Her heart stopped, then started again racing. She stripped off her gloves, her fingers suddenly clumsy, and tried calling Aisha straight to voicemail. She called again. Same result. The phone was off. Rachel ran down the hallway past startled colleagues out to the parking lot. She broke every speed limit getting to the library, her mind spinning through possibilities, each worse than the last. Maybe Aisha dropped her phone. Maybe the battery died. Maybe she was being dramatic, and this was nothing but the message. Help lib. Those weren't random letters. Mrs. Chun looked up when Rachel burst through the library doors, and the expression on the librarian's face confirmed every fear. I'm so sorry. I thought she knew him. He said there was an emergency that you'd sent him. A man came and took her maybe 20 minutes ago. Rachel's legs nearly gave out. What man? What did he look like? Mrs. Chun described him. Khaki pants, button-down shirt, glasses. Polite, said there was an accident at the hospital. He knew your name, knew details about you. Aisha seemed scared, but she went with him. The security footage took 3 minutes to pull up. 3 minutes that felt like hours. And there, in grainy black and white, Rachel watched her daughter walk out of the library with a man whose face she recognized immediately. Craig. The blood drained from her face. She knew exactly who had her daughter, and that knowledge was somehow worse than not knowing. The police arrived within minutes of her call. Rachel was shaking so badly she could barely hold the phone. Officers took her statement while others reviewed the footage, radioed descriptions, began the machinery of search and rescue. But Craig had a 2-hour head start, maybe more. 2 hours was an eternity. He could be anywhere. The Amber Alert went out across the state within the hour. Aisha's picture on highway signs, on phone screens, on the news. But Craig was smart. He planned this. He stayed off major highways, taking back roads through small towns where traffic cameras were sparse and patrol cars were few. He drove carefully, never speeding, never drawing attention. Just another man driving with a quiet child in the passenger seat. Rachel sat in the police station, her hands wrapped around cold coffee she couldn't drink and drowned in guilt that threatened to pull her under. She should have filed the restraining order. She should have pushed harder when Craig disappeared instead of feeling relieved he was gone. She should have warned Aisha more explicitly, shown her his picture, made sure her daughter knew to run if she ever saw him. Every should have was a knife twisting deeper. The lead detective, a woman named Torres with kind eyes and 15 years of experience, sat across from Rachel and spoke in the tone of someone who'd done this too many times. "We're doing everything we can. We have his vehicle description. His photo is being distributed. Every officer in 3 states is looking for them." But Rachel heard what wasn't being said. 2 hours was a lifetime in cases like this. Craig drove with both hands on the wheel, his knuckles white. In the passenger seat, Aisha sat silent, her seatbelt fastened, her eyes fixed on the passing landscape. She tried asking where they were going. Craig told her they were going somewhere safe, somewhere her mother would meet them. The lie tasted bitter in his mouth, but he'd convinced himself it would become true eventually. His plan was simple in the way delusions often are. He'd rented a cabin 3 states away, remote enough that no one would find them under a name that couldn't be traced back to him. He'd stocked it with food, with supplies, with everything they'd need for weeks. He believed that given time, Aisha would understand. That Rachel, desperate to get her daughter back, would come to him, that they could finally be the family he'd envisioned. But Craig made one critical mistake. He needed supplies. Fresh food, more water, things he'd forgotten in his meticulous planning. And in exactly 14 minutes, he would pull into a supermarket parking lot, the closest store for 50 miles, where Victor was loading groceries into his saddlebags. Victor was in the cereal aisle, debating between 2 brands he'd bought 100 times before. When they walked through the automatic doors, he glanced up out of habit, the way someone trained to assess environments always does, and something in his chest tightened immediately. A man and a little black girl. At first glance, nothing unusual, father and daughter probably running errands, picking up supplies, except everything about the picture was wrong. Victor's eyes, trained by years of military service and 3 decades of paying attention, cataloged the details in seconds. The girl's body language was completely wrong. She wasn't walking naturally. Her spine was rigid, her shoulders pulled up tight near her ears like she was trying to make herself smaller. Children with their parents moved with ease, with familiarity. This child looked like she was walking on a tightrope over a canyon. The man wasn't holding her hand. His grip was on her shoulder, firm and controlling, the way you'd hold something you were afraid might run. His fingers pressed into her small frame with a possessiveness that made Victor's jaw clench. The girl's eyes were darting everywhere, scanning faces, searching, looking for something or someone. That kind of desperate visual scanning wasn't normal. It was the behavior of prey animals, of people in danger trying to find an exit. And the man was sweating, not the light perspiration of someone who'd been outside on a warm day, but the kind of nervous sweat that came from adrenaline, from stress. The supermarket was cool, air-conditioned to the point where Victor had noticed the chill when he'd entered 20 minutes earlier. There was no reason for this man to be sweating unless something was very, very wrong. Victor set down the cereal box. His heart rate kicked up steady and controlled the way it used to on missions that heightened state of alertness, where time seemed to slow and detail sharpened. He watched them move deeper into the store, the man pulling the girl toward the refrigerated section. They weren't really shopping. The man was grabbing items randomly, his movements quick and distracted like someone checking boxes on a list just to get out faster. Aisha saw him then, the big man in the leather vest, standing still while everyone else moved around him, watching. Something about his presence, his size, the way he seemed to fill space without trying, made her think of protection, made her think of safety. She didn't know who he was, didn't recognize him, but some instinct told her he might be her only chance. Her hand slipped from her side, moving behind Craig's back where he couldn't see. Her palm faced outward, fingers spread. Then, exactly as Officer Dawson had taught her 3 weeks ago, she tucked her thumb into her palm, folded her fingers down over it, held the position for 3 seconds, released, did it again. Time fractured for Victor. One moment he was standing in a supermarket aisle, and the next he was staring at a small hand, making the signal he taught himself to recognize anywhere, anytime, under any circumstances. The signal for help, thumb tucked, fingers folded, unmistakable, deliberate. Every instinct from his military training, every haunted memory of his sister Sophie, who'd vanished when she was 12 and never came home. Every child he taught to yell and fight and survive. Every promise he'd made to himself that he'd never look away, never be the person who didn't act. All of it converged in this single moment. His first thought was clear and cold. That child is in danger. His second thought came just as fast. What do I do? Call the police. That was protocol. That was smart. That was what any reasonable person would do. But calling meant time, meant explaining meant the man and girl could be gone before anyone arrived. What if the man was armed? What if confronting him put the girl in more danger? What if Victor was wrong? What if his instincts were failing him? What if this was actually a father with his daughter, and he was about to cause a scene that would humiliate an innocent family? But the signal. Children didn't flash that signal by accident. It was too specific, too deliberate. And the girl's body language, the man's behavior, everything Victor's trained eye was reading screamed that something was catastrophically wrong. Victor made his decision in the space between heartbeats. He couldn't risk losing them. He couldn't risk being wrong, and watching them walk out those doors while he stood frozen by doubt. He'd rather be embarrassed, rather be wrong, rather face the consequences of overreacting than live with the knowledge that he'd seen a child asking for help and done nothing. He abandoned his shopping cart in the middle of the aisle and began following them. He moved casually, picking up items he didn't need, pretending to read labels, but never letting them out of his sight. The man was moving faster now, pulling the girl toward the front of the store. Victor could see the exit doors ahead, could see the parking lot beyond them. Victor had about 90 seconds to come up with a plan because Craig was heading toward the exit. And once they reached that parking lot, Aisha would disappear forever. Craig was moving faster now, his hand tight on Aisha's shoulder, practically dragging her toward the automatic doors. He'd grabbed 3 items, paid with cash, didn't make eye contact with the cashier. Every second in that store felt like exposure, like risk. He needed to get back on the road, get to the cabin, get away from witnesses and cameras and the possibility of anyone recognizing them from the alert that he knew must be spreading across every screen in the state. Victor stayed 20 feet behind, his massive frame moving with surprising quiet. His mind was racing through scenarios, calculations, possibilities. He couldn't let them reach the car. Once they were inside a vehicle, once doors locked and an engine started, the girl was gone. But he also couldn't tackle this man in a parking lot with a terrified child between them. Couldn't risk her getting hurt in a struggle. Couldn't risk the man being armed, panicking, doing something desperate. The automatic doors slid open, and Craig pulled Aisha into the bright afternoon sun. The parking lot stretched before them, cars glinting, heat shimmering off asphalt. Craig's sedan was parked in the back corner. Isolated, exactly where someone who didn't want attention would leave it. Victor moved fast. He couldn't think anymore, couldn't calculate, could only act on instinct, and 30 years of trusting his gut when it mattered most. He stepped around them in a wide arc, his boots hitting pavement hard, and positioned himself directly in their path. Then he did something Craig never expected. Victor smiled. A huge, genuine, delighted smile. The kind you give someone you're genuinely happy to see. Craig Hendris. "Man, is that you?" His voice boomed across the parking lot, loud and friendly and impossible to ignore. Several people loading groceries into their cars looked up. A woman pushing a cart paused. Victor was creating an audience, making this a public moment, making it impossible for Craig to simply disappear. Craig stopped so abruptly that Aisha stumbled. His face went white, then red. Confusion flooded his expression. He didn't know this man, had never seen him before in his life. But this biker was walking toward them like they were old buddies, his arms spread in a gesture of welcome. Victor's strategy was brilliant in its simplicity. He wasn't accusing, wasn't threatening. He was creating a social situation that trapped Craig more effectively than any physical barrier could, because people were watching now. And Craig couldn't just run without looking suspicious. Couldn't shove past this friendly stranger without drawing exactly the kind of attention he was desperately trying to avoid. "I can't believe it's you, man. It's been what, 5 years? 6? Victor kept walking closer, his smile never wavering. Aisha looked up at Victor, and her eyes told him everything he needed to know. They were wide, pleading, desperate. She didn't know who this man was either, but she understood somehow that he was help, that he'd seen her signal, that he was the answer to a prayer she'd been repeating in her mind for the last 2 hours. "And this must be your daughter." Victor's voice carried across the parking lot, ensuring everyone within 30 feet could hear. "She looks just like you, man. Beautiful kid. How old is she now?" Craig's mouth opened, but no words came out. His grip on Aisha's shoulder tightened reflexively, and Victor saw her wince. The smile stayed on Victor's face, but his eyes went hard. He'd seen that grip, recognized it for what it was. Control, ownership, fear. More people were watching now. The woman with the cart had stopped completely, sensing something off in this interaction. A man loading bags into his trunk was paying attention. His movement slowed. Craig could feel the weight of those eyes, could feel the situation spiraling out of his control. Victor stepped closer still, near enough now that he towered over both of them, his shadow falling across Aisha's small frame. And then his voice dropped low enough that only Craig could hear, all pretense of friendliness stripped away. "I saw the signal. I know what you did. And you've got 2 choices. You let go of her right now, or I make sure everyone in this parking lot knows exactly who you are." The words hit Craig like a physical blow. His mind raced, fragments of thought colliding. This biker knew. Somehow he knew. Which meant the police were probably coming, which meant he had seconds, not minutes, which meant his entire plan, months of preparation, the cabin waiting 3 states away. All of it was collapsing around him. He could see it in Victor's eyes. This man wasn't bluffing. This man would fight, would make a scene, would hold him here until the police arrived. And Craig, who'd spent weeks convincing himself he was clever enough to pull this off, suddenly understood, with perfect clarity, that it was over. His hand released Aisha's shoulder. Then, in a motion born of pure panic and self-preservation, he shoved her hard toward Victor. She stumbled forward with a small cry, and Victor's arms caught her instinctively, steadying her small frame against his chest. Craig ran, sprinted toward his car, keys already in his hand, his breath coming in gasps. He didn't look back, didn't hesitate, operating on nothing but animal fear, and the desperate hope that he could still get away, could still salvage something from this disaster. If you're on Victor's side and believe heroes come in all forms, hit that like button. Show trolls and doubters that kindness and courage still exist. Victor's arms closed around Aisha instinctively, one hand cradling the back of her head, the other wrapped protectively around her small shoulders. She was shaking, her whole body trembling like a leaf in wind. Craig's car was already tearing out of the parking lot, tires squealing, but Victor didn't chase. His priority was the child in his arms, not the man fleeing justice. His phone was out in seconds, dialing 911 with one hand while keeping Aisha pressed against his chest with the other. He positioned himself so his body was between her and the exit, between her and any possible threat. A human shield born from instinct and training, and a promise he'd made to himself 33 years ago when his sister disappeared. The 911 operator's voice came through calm and professional, and Victor's response was equally controlled despite the adrenaline flooding his system. I have an abducted child, 8 years old, black girl with braids, pink shirt. The man who took her just fled in a dark blue sedan license plate he rattled off from memory, heading east on Route 40. His name is Craig Hendress. There's an Amber Alert. She's safe now, but she needs her mother. People were gathering. Shoppers who'd witnessed the confrontation, their faces confused and concerned. A woman approached, asking if everything was okay, if they needed help. Victor nodded, his voice steady. Police are coming. She's safe now. The woman stayed anyway, standing nearby like an additional barrier between Aisha and the world. For those first 3 minutes, Aisha held herself together through sheer force of will. She stood pressed against Victor's side, his hand resting gently on her shoulder, the opposite of Craig's controlling grip. She focused on breathing, on the solidity of this stranger who'd somehow understood her silent plea, on the fact that Craig was gone, and she was still here. But the moment she heard the sirens in the distance, something inside her broke open. The adrenaline that had kept her functional, that had allowed her to make the signal and hold herself together during the most terrifying hours of her young life, drained away all at once. She collapsed into sobs, her small body shaking with the force of fear and relief and trauma, all hitting her simultaneously. Victor knelt immediately, bringing himself down to her eye level. His rough tattooed hands that looked like they could break bones, touched her shoulders with extraordinary gentleness. Hey, you're okay now. You're safe. I've got you. Aisha couldn't speak through the crying, could only gulp air and shake. Victor kept talking, his voice low and calm and steady. You did perfect, sweetheart. That signal you made, that saved your life. You remembered exactly what to do, and you were so brave. Your mama's going to be so proud of you. The police arrived in a cascade of sirens and flashing lights. 3 patrol cars converging on the parking lot within minutes of Victor's call. Officers jumped out, hands on weapons until they assessed the scene and understood the child was safe. The threat was gone. Victor stood slowly, keeping one hand on Aisha's shoulder, and explained everything in clear, concise sentences. The signal, the confrontation, Craig's description and direction of travel. One officer was already on the radio, relaying information, coordinating with units ahead. Another knelt beside Aisha, her voice soft, asking gentle questions. A third took Victor aside for his statement. The machinery of law enforcement kicked into high gear, roadblocks being set up, helicopters being deployed, every available unit converging on the search. Within 18 minutes, Craig would be stopped at a roadblock 60 miles away. But the story was far from over. Because when Rachel arrived at the supermarket and saw her daughter safe in Victor's arms, what happened next would change both their lives forever. Rachel's car skidded into the parking lot before the officer on scene had even finished radioing her location. She didn't bother with proper parking, just abandoned the vehicle at an angle across 2 spaces, and ran. Her eyes scanned frantically until they locked on the small figure surrounded by police officers. And then she was sprinting, her nurse's clogs slapping against asphalt, her breath coming in gasps that were half sobs. Aisha saw her mother and broke free from the female officer's gentle hold. They collided in the middle of the parking lot. Rachel dropping to her knees so hard it would leave bruises, her arms wrapping around her daughter with a desperation that came from believing she might never hold her again. Aisha buried her face in her mother's neck, and they stayed that way, clinging to each other. Both crying so hard, neither could speak. Rachel's hands moved over Aisha's hair, her face, her shoulders, checking for injuries she couldn't see, needing the physical confirmation that her daughter was whole and real and here. She kept whispering the same words over and over. "I've got you, baby. You're safe. I've got you. Mama's here." The relief was so profound, it was almost painful. A release of tension that had been coiled so tight she thought it might break her. The officers gave them space, stepping back to let the moment unfold. Other shoppers watched with tears in their own eyes, strangers bearing witness to a reunion that reminded them what mattered, what was worth fighting for, what could be lost, and miraculously found again. When Rachel finally pulled back enough to look at her daughter's face, she saw Victor standing a respectful distance away. She'd been so focused on Aisha, she hadn't registered him until now. The massive biker in the leather vest, tattoos covering his arms, standing with his hands clasped in front of him like he didn't quite know what to do with them. Rachel stood on shaking legs, one arm still wrapped around Aisha, and walked toward him. She opened her mouth to speak, and nothing came out. How do you thank someone for giving you back everything that matters? What words exist that are big enough, adequate enough, true enough to capture what he'd done? Victor saw her struggling and shifted uncomfortably. He'd never been good with gratitude, never known how to accept praise. "She saved herself," he said quietly, nodding toward Aisha. "She knew the signal. She was brave enough to use it. I just happened to be there." But Rachel was shaking her head, tears still streaming down her face. "You didn't just happen to be there. You saw her. You acted. You brought my baby back to me." Her voice broke on the last words. Victor looked down at his boots, then back up at Rachel. Anyone would have done the same. Rachel's expression said she knew that wasn't true, that most people would have looked away, would have doubted, would have convinced themselves it wasn't their business. She reached out and touched his arm, her hand small against his tattooed forearm. "I need your contact information, please." Victor hesitated. He didn't want recognition, didn't want news interviews or attention or people calling him a hero. But Rachel's expression was firm despite the tears. "You gave me my daughter back. I need you to know what that means." And something in her voice made him nod and pull out his phone. Craig Hendress was arrested at a police roadblock 63 miles east of the supermarket. He didn't resist, didn't try to run. When officers approached his vehicle with weapons drawn, he simply raised his hands and stepped out. The fight had gone out of him the moment Victor spoke those words in the parking lot. He knew it was over. What investigators found in the following days painted a picture far more disturbing than a single impulsive act. Craig's apartment contained detailed notes about Rachel's schedule, photographs taken from a distance, maps with routes marked in red ink. His computer revealed months of surveillance, obsessive planning, rental agreements for the cabin under a false name. He'd been watching them for 2 years, his obsession growing like a cancer, feeding on rejection and delusion until it consumed whatever rational thinking he'd once possessed. The charges came swift and severe. Kidnapping, child endangerment, stalking, violating the restraining order Rachel had finally filed and he'd ignored. The district attorney built a case so airtight that Craig's lawyer advised him to accept a plea deal rather than face trial. He was sentenced to 25 years in a state prison, eligible for parole only after serving 85% of his sentence. Aisha never had to testify. The security footage from the library and supermarket, combined with Victor's detailed witness account and the evidence found in Craig's apartment, provided more than enough for conviction. Rachel was grateful for that mercy, grateful her daughter wouldn't have to relive those hours in a courtroom while her abductor watched. The story spread through the community like wildfire. Then beyond. Local news picked it up first, then regional outlets, then national morning shows. Schools across the state began incorporating the signal for help into their safety curriculums. Officer Patricia Dawson, who taught that assembly at Aisha's school, received commendations from the police department and requests to train other officers in recognizing distress signals. Victor was interviewed by local news exactly once. He sat uncomfortably in his leather vest, answered questions in short sentences, and deflected every attempt to call him a hero. "The real hero is that little girl," he told the reporter firmly. "She's the one who remembered. She's the one who was brave enough to ask for help. I just paid attention." 6 months after that day in the supermarket parking lot, Victor's phone rang with a familiar number. Rachel asking if he was free Saturday morning. There was a community safety fair at the elementary school, and she wondered if he'd help teach kids about awareness and the signal for help. Victor said yes, without hesitation. What started as a single favor became something neither of them expected. A friendship built on shared purpose and mutual respect. Victor began running regular workshops through his nonprofit, teaching children basic safety awareness, how to trust their instincts, how to ask for help when something felt wrong. Rachel volunteered alongside him, sharing her family story with other parents, helping them recognize the warning signs of obsessive behavior, encouraging them to act on concerns rather than dismissing them. They discovered they made a good team. Victor's presence commanded attention, his military bearing and imposing size ensuring kids took the lesson seriously. Rachel's warmth and vulnerability made parents listen, made them understand this wasn't abstract fear-mongering, but real danger that had touched a real family in their own community. Aisha was healing. The process was slow and non-linear, marked by good days and hard nights. She saw a therapist weekly, a kind woman who specialized in childhood trauma and knew how to help an 8-year-old process experiences no child should have to carry. But gradually, steadily, Aisha began reclaiming pieces of herself that Craig had tried to steal. She still drew constantly, her sketchbooks filled with the usual subjects, dragons and princesses and flowers. But interspersed throughout were drawings of a big man with a beard and tattoos and a smile that made him look gentle despite his size. She started calling him Uncle Victor after the 3rd workshop, and the name stuck. Victor, who'd never had children of his own, found himself with a niece who drew him pictures and saved him seats and trusted him completely. At a community event on a sunny Saturday morning, Victor and Rachel stood before a group of 30 children and twice as many parents. Aisha stood with them, no longer hiding behind her mother, but standing tall, demonstrating the signal for help with confidence. Palm out, thumb tucked, fingers folded down. She showed them slowly, explained clearly, and answered questions from kids who saw her not as a victim, but as someone who'd survived something scary and come out the other side. Victor never wanted to be called a hero. He'd tell you he just did what anyone should do. Pay attention, care enough to act, and never walk away from someone in danger. But that's exactly what makes him one. This story isn't just about one little black girl and one biker. It's about the power of awareness, the importance of teaching children to protect themselves, and the courage to act when every instinct tells you to look away. The signal for help is real, and it's simple enough that anyone can learn it in seconds. Palm facing outward like you're waving. Tuck your thumb into your palm. Fold your fingers down over your thumb, trapping it. That's it. 3 movements that could save a life. This signal was created during the pandemic as a way for people to communicate distress silently, especially during video calls when they couldn't speak freely. But it works anywhere, in cars, in stores, in crowds. Teach it to your children. Teach it to your teenagers. Make sure they know that if they ever flash this signal, someone who understands will recognize they need help. And if you ever see someone make this gesture, don't look away. Don't assume someone else will handle it. Be the person who pays attention. If you believe that people like Craig should never harm another child, comment "Protect the Innocent." Let's make sure this story reaches parents, teachers, and communities everywhere. Every comment pushes this video to more people who need to hear it, more families who need to know about this signal, more children who deserve the tools to protect themselves. If you stand with Victor and refuse to walk past someone in danger, hit that subscribe button, because every week I bring you stories of real people who chose courage over comfort, who saw something wrong and did something about it, who prove that ordinary people can do extraordinary things when it matters most. And if you know someone who needs to hear this story, a parent worried about their child's safety, a teacher looking for ways to empower their students, a friend who works with vulnerable populations, share this video. You might just save a life. You might be the reason someone learns this signal, teaches it to their child, recognizes it in a moment of crisis. That ripple effect starts with you. The signal for help was created to save lives in silence. Aisha used it. Victor saw it. And because both of them were prepared for a moment they prayed would never come, a little girl came home. Never underestimate the power of paying attention. Never doubt that one person can make all the difference. And never forget that angels come in all forms, even leather jackets and motorcycle boots. Thank you for watching. I'll see you in the next